Hi, I'm Chef Julia Dunaway, and I make whole food, plant-based food with no oil. And I make everything from entrees to appetizers to desserts, and I have lots of specialty things that I'm known for, Asian food, Japanese especially. But since it's that time of year for desserts, and especially holiday desserts, I wanted to make my special pecan pie. So pecan pie is something that my family always requested, especially my husband. And so I used to make it every year, Thanksgiving and Christmas. And I would make the kind you find on the back of your Karo syrup, you know, the high fructose corn syrup we're not supposed to use. But I would make it every year, and it has corn syrup, eggs, sugar, butter, pecans, and a pie crust that has oil in it, of course. So no more of that. So then it's kind of like, well, what do you make? How do you make pie if you can't use butter, eggs, and the usual things that you use in crusts and to make things taste really rich? Lots of sugar, whatever. So over the years, I've figured out different ways to make things good. I've been eating plant-based since 2017 and a lot healthier version since 2020. So even with desserts, I've tried to make them taste better. In the beginning, I would make them, but they didn't taste that good. For example, my pecan pie that I'm making today, I had in an ebook, a couple of different ebooks. My first ebook was plant-based holiday desserts, and the pecan pie was in this one. And it's also in one of my ebooks, I don't have it right here in front of me, called Plant-Based Holiday Table. But the crust on this one was kind of, I don't know, boring. It had rolled oats, pitted dates, and almond butter, little almond milk. Nothing all that great. It was okay, but it was just kind of like a crumbly crust, not like a real pie crust. So I was looking around for a different kind of pie crust, and I came upon one, and I can't remember where it's from. My friend told me the ingredients on the phone, basically. And then I tried it, and it worked pretty good. And I played around with it a little bit, but it's basically just very plain flours and water, nothing fancy. So we're going to make that. And we're also going to use my scale. I'm not going to use cups. I'm going to use this inexpensive food scale. I think my husband got this one for me at Walmart. And it works fine. You can set it on grams. You can set it on pounds and ounces. You could set it on milliliters, but I'm going to put it on grams. And I'm going to weigh everything for my recipe. I have all my ingredients here on this tray. And the reason I'm going to use a scale is because a scale is much more accurate. When you start telling people to use cups, and spoonfuls and cups, there's a tendency for people to overdo it, to just get carried away. And it's usually too much. So they're packing the stuff down, and it's just too much. So what you do with your food scale is you zero it out. There's a button. It's T-A-R-E. I pronounce it tear, but that might not be right. But when you hit that button, it zeroes it out to 0. And then I'm going to put 168 grams, and it'll start showing it up on the scale. And I'm just going to gently put it in here, and I kind of know, when to stop. But see, it's a little too much, so I'm going to take some out. 168 is where I'm going to stop. Okay, so then, like my next ingredient, so that I zero it again, I hit that button again, and it goes back to 0. And my next ingredient is brown rice flour. You could also use white rice flour, but I'm using brown rice flour because I'm trying to make everything whole grain. So I need 70 grams of that, not as much. And I don't have the equivalent in cups right now, but I will put it in the show notes or in the, the YouTube notes, 70. And then, so you'll have it in case you don't have a scale. And then 60 grams of tapioca starch, so I zero it out again. This time it's 60. And tapioca flour is kind of like cornstarch. It's a thickener. I got a little carried away with it, so I'm getting it out of here. Okay, there we go. Close enough. And then salt is measured, so we don't need a scale anymore. Then I always hit the button Again, because that turns it off, because it's a battery operated scale, so you don't want to leave it on. Run out all your batteries. 1/4 teaspoon of salt, and I always use kosher salt. That's just what I keep around. Some people will use fine sea salt, so it doesn't matter, whatever, just some type of salt. 2 tablespoons of sugar. If you are using this crust to make like some kind of vegetable pot pie or something, which you could use this crust for a savory pie, cauliflower vegetable pie or whatever, then don't put the sugar in, okay? And then the next ingredients are going to be water. But first we need to whisk this all together. So instead of sifting, Grandma used to sift everything in a sifter. Nowadays we don't have sifters in our cabinet. I do, but I hardly ever take it out because I don't want to have to mess with it. I don't want to have to wash it. You're not supposed to wash it. But anyway, it's just not a thing that you see in today's kitchen. So instead of sifting, the tendency now is to use a whisk and whisk everything together. But you have to make sure you whisk it together well, because if you don't whisk it thoroughly, like take the time to do it, what will happen is you'll have little pockets of one ingredient and not the other. So then we would end up with pockets of tapioca starch and not enough of our flour. So we don't want to do that. We want to make sure it's evenly divided. So then we're going to take some water. We've got to put the water, here it is. And we're only going to add 4 tablespoons to begin with. So I've got this is filtered water. 2, 3. Because once you put too much water in your dough, you can't take it out, okay? You can't say, oh, well, I put too much water in there. Let's see, maybe I'll add some more flour. Maybe I'll add some more tapioca starch. It doesn't work like that. Once you've added too much water, you've messed it up. So better to add the 4 tablespoons of water, then mix it up really well. Try to get it all kind of moistened. And then we're going to add 1 more. Spread it around a little bit. So you only add 1 at a time, because we don't want this dough to be too wet, but it has to be wet enough to hold together. See, right now you could tell it's not going to hold together if we try to roll it out. It's just dry as can be. So we know we need to add another tablespoon of water. So that's 6 now, okay? The total is between 5 and 7. So let's see what happens when we've added 6. Can this turn into a dough? And the only way you're really going to know is if you get in there with your hands and try to form it into a dough. No, it's still so dry, it does not hold together. So that tells me we're down to 1 more tablespoon to make it 7, which is kind of the max. So let's see what happens when we have 7. And I think that's going to be the magic number. I can tell that pretty much all the little pieces are moist and it's starting to come together. So I think we can say 7 was the magic number. Now it's forming an actual dough. So I got my hands in here because sometimes hands are the best tools. And you see it's forming a nice ball that will stick together. And until it does that, you can't really roll it out, because the next step we have to do is roll it out. So get it all together in your ball. Get it off your hands. Of course, make sure your hands are clean when you start. That's always the rule in the kitchen. Simple, but you'd be surprised at how many people may not be following that, right? Gotta wash my hands a little bit. All right, so the next step is we're going to roll this dough out on parchment paper. I'm going to get a nice generous sized piece of parchment paper. I've got a rolling pin. And, this out of the way, we're going to take our dough and just kind of form it into a ball, because we want it to be as round as possible before we start. We don't want to have to try to mess with it too much. And we're going to press it down into a disc to begin with before we actually start rolling it, just like you would with a pie crust. And then I like to kind of straighten out the edges. It just makes it look better when you start rolling it out. And then we take our rolling pin, and it's not necessary to flour the rolling pin or anything with this type of dough. I guess because it's not made with butter and stuff, that it doesn't really stick to stuff as much. And then just like you would with any dough, you just roll it out. Of course, now I said that, it's starting to stick. So we're going to take a little bit of our tapioca starch, and I'm going to put it on the rolling pin. So that's what it means to improvise. I didn't have to do that the last time, but see, that's keeping it from sticking. So there you go. And I'm just going to rotate my parchment paper around to roll the dough out, because that works well. And we want the dough to be thin, but it can't be super, super thin because it doesn't have any gluten. There's no gluten in this kind of dough because it's made from almond flour, tapioca flour, rice flour. These are all kind of, you could even call this a gluten-free crust because there's no gluten in it. Well, gluten helps things stay stretchy. So without the gluten, we have to kind of be careful not to overdo this. And this is by far the trickiest part of this whole process, is doing the pie crust. So if you're an experienced baker, this is nothing to you. And I'm not a super specialist in baking. That's never been my thing. I do okay, but you know, that wasn't my favorite class in culinary school. I like savory a lot better. So how do I know this is the right size? This is my 9-inch pie plate, and I just set it down. I know it's plenty big. So use a 9-inch pie plate. Don't get fancy and don't get a big deep dish, super duper giant 10-inch thing. You could probably also use a 9-inch tart pan. I can't tell you for sure how this would work because I have not tried it. But I think next time I make this, I'm going to try it in the tart pan because it's non-stick and the bottom is removable. So that would make it easy to get out. Okay, so how do we get the pie crust in here? Well, I'm just going to set it upside down and turn it over. That keeps you from having to travel around with it. And then we just lift the parchment paper off. Then we're going to ease it. We don't want to try to manipulate it. We want to ease it down into the pie pan. So take the edge of it and then kind of let it come down into the pie dish. We're not trying to force it and stretch it because stretching it is not going to work. It's just going to get real brittle wherever you stretch it. And that way, it's all down in the pan and there's extra. So we take the extra and we're just going to kind of take a knife and go around and trim it. It doesn't have to be perfect. And the trim part is edible. When I tested this recipe, I took the trimmings and I used a little pecan pie filling and I made some cookies with it. And to test my recipe to see how it tasted, and those cookies were really good. It's like eating them thinking, well, this would be a recipe to make this into a cookie. You just take pie crust, form it in whatever shape you want it, put the pecan pie filling on it and bake it. And just that is really good. So if you make this experiment with this little bit of scraps you have left and see if you can make a couple of cookies with it, like I did. So then the last thing for your crust, before we put it in the oven, and we are going to pre-bake it for 5 minutes at 350, is make some kind of design. Now my favorite simple design is this one, where you put your thumb and hold your fingers. So you're taking your thumb, holding 2 fingers, and then pressing it, and it creates this cute little design. I think it's a cute little design. You know, the other common design is to just take a fork and use the tines of a fork to create little fork marks in your crust. And I've done that many times. Or, you know, if you don't want to get this fancy, which this isn't really fancy, you can just keep your crust the way it is. Just fold it over plain. It doesn't even have to have any kind of design in it. But I like to have a design. I think that makes it look more special in the long run. And try not to, manipulate the dough too much. It's starting to get a little sticky, so I'm going to put that little bit of tapioca flour on my hands, because then they're not going to stick to the dough. So if you're making your pie crust and it starts sticking to the pie crust, remember that. Dip your hand in just a little bit of tapioca starch, because that's like cornstarch. Things don't stick to it. Not much anyway. Almost done. And this is the same design I used to use to make, you know, old-fashioned, all the pies I used to make. Pumpkin pie, pecan pie, whatever. I always used to do it the same way. And it's working fine with this very different kind of crust. It's whole grain, kind of a gluten-free, no fat added, although, you know, almond flour is made from nuts. So, you know, anything made from almond flour has some built-in fat from almonds. So we can't say that it's like a super fat-free pie crust, because it really doesn't have the no fat quality. Get a fork. Should have got this earlier. Okay, then we're gonna prick it with a fork. I do it like 6 times. And then what I did when I made it before was I set it on a baking sheet before I put it in the oven. And the reason for that is because it's really fragile. Pie crusts are kind of fragile, so you don't want to be lifting it up, because then you can knock off your pretty, you know, scallop-looking edges. So we're going to put this in here, and we only need to put it in here for 5 minutes. We set the timer for 5 minutes, because we are going to be baking our filling in the crust. So we're just going to give the crust a tiny little head start, and then we're going to get to the filling and fill the pie next. All right, so now it's time to get this filling made. I've got the crust out of the oven. 5 minutes is all I had to put it in there for. And that just kind of, if you could feel it, it's firmed it up really nicely. It's not as soft and crumbly as it was. So now we're going to make the filling. And I'm using these great pecans. I'll have to show you. They're from Oliver Pecan Company in San Saba, Texas. And San Saba, Texas is in the hill country, and it's the pecan capital of the world. Not Texas, the world. And they sent us 10 pounds of cracked pecans, which look like this, and then my husband sits around and cleans them out for me and eats about half of them. And then I have a bunch of clean, beautiful pecans to use for my recipe. And we do call them pecans, not pecans. I think pecans must be the local southern way to say it, and then I think people in the Northeast may call them pecans, but if you come to Texas and say pecans, everybody will look at you funny. So, but call it whatever you want. They're delicious. People grow them here in their yards. They're everywhere. So in the food processor, we're going to add a cup of the pecan halves, because I only have pecan halves. I don't have bits and pieces. I'll never buy those bits and pieces because they're not very helpful to me. And I'm going to process this until it's like a course meal. We have to be careful not to process it too much, because we don't want it to turn into flour. We do want it to be, you know, more like a, we want to be able to get it off the stand. So as you can see, it is kind of crumbly, like ground nuts. Now I did spy kind of a big chunk in there, but that's not going to matter, because we're going to combine this part with some chopped pecans. So if there's a big piece that's snuck in there, because sometimes in the food processor, big pieces just don't get ground up, and it doesn't really matter. But most of them are like this nice, almost like a pecan flour, but not quite that fine. Because with our almond flour, the almond flour is really fine. We don't really need it to be like that. All right, so there's our pecan meal, and to that we're going to be adding a cup of chopped pecans. So I went ahead and did this already. I took the pecan halves and chopped them, just kind of your typical size that you would call chopped pecans, not too small, not too big. So we're going to add that. And then we're going to mix some of our other ingredients together. I'm trying to find my other bowl. Get it out of here. So we're gonna take our kind of our wet ingredients for this in a different bowl. I'm gonna set this aside, and now we're gonna take our maple syrup, coconut nectar, and some different seasonings. So I have 3/4 of a cup of maple syrup, and I use just your pure maple syrup. I use this brand you can get at the local grocery store. This is not the time to use, you know, the kind that I used to give my kids. I won't mention any names, but you know, it wasn't pure maple syrup. It was cheap. It's cheap maple syrup, maple flavored syrup, because I had 4 kids and they used syrup like it was water. They used so much syrup, I would have to tell them, don't use so much syrup, it's too much sugar, and they still used it. So that's not the kind of syrup you want to buy for this kind of recipe, because you want it to be pure maple syrup and not have all the high fructose corn syrup, whatever. This is coconut syrup, coconut nectar. You can tell it's pretty thick and rich. And it's from the sap, let's see, what does it say? Coconut tree sap nectar. And you know, it's one of those low glycemic types of sweeteners. So some people like to use things like date syrup and coconut nectar, coconut syrup, you know, because they think that it's a better form of sugar if you're going to use sugar and something. So give it a try and see if you like it. I think it adds another dimension to the flavor profile, so I kind of like to use different things. And then we're going to put in some flax seeds, ground flax seeds, 3 tablespoons. These are, as you can tell, they're from a local chain, and they're fine. I use them every day in smoothies, so they are organic, and I always have them around. So any kind of ground flaxseed works good. 1/4 of a cup of almond milk. I'll show you the kind I used, and it is this Califia Farms almond milk. I know a lot of people make their own almond milk from their, you know, organic milk making machines, nut milk. I can't remember all the names, but there are a lot of companies now that have these nut milk makers, and you don't have to add any other ingredients to your nut milk other than nuts. So, you know, if you want to do that, that's even better. If you can make your own nut milk, it'll always have, you know, higher quality ingredients than anything you can buy. I got syrup on my hands. I highly encourage you to use, you know, whatever works best. But I like this brand of almond milk pretty well. Okay, we're going to add 1/2 teaspoon of ground cinnamon. I know a lot of people like Ceylon cinnamon the best. It's very popular, so if you get that, fine. Just 1/2 teaspoon. Then we're going to put in some vanilla. A teaspoon of vanilla. And I get this organic, pure vanilla extract. And it's a little more pricey, but I just think it tastes better. It doesn't have, it's not artificial tasting. And I think that's all of our ingredients. Oh no, we need to put 1/8 of a teaspoon of salt. So that's not very much. Salt, in sweet things, salt can be very helpful. Sometimes you don't think salt is needed, but just a little bit of it, it kind of just makes the flavor pop, I think. And then last but not least, we have a couple more things, 2 tablespoons of unsalted almond butter. And I get this kind from the gourmet grocery store that we have here. It's called Central Market. But they make it there, you know, in the grocery store. They have a section where they're making their own almond butter. And I like it because it's really smooth and easy to pour out. So sometimes you get the jars of almond butter and they're super expensive for one thing. You have to get a lot, and they're pricey, but then it'll be really thick and you have to stir it and stir it and stir it for a million years before you can use it. And it doesn't dissolve well. Well, this, because it's already kind of soft, you can see it'll start dissolving really nicely in the liquid. So that's why I get it from the bulk section of the grocery store. If you get jarred almond butter, just, you know, look at the different types and get one that has a nice smooth texture. Some of them seems like they're almost grainy and thick. They don't do well in these kind of recipes. So this looks like it would benefit from the whisk because I can see undissolved almond butter in here. So this is where the whisk comes in handy because, you know, the whisk used to be used to beat eggs. So it's got like this little area on the end that gets in there and breaks things up. So see that quickly, that broke up all the almond butter. And it's gonna look a little curdly because it's got almond butter and flax meal and different things in there, but that's okay because remember, we're gonna be adding all our pecans. So now we've got everything in it. 2 tablespoons of whole wheat pastry flour. I've got that in my little bowl. So I'm just gonna throw that in here, and that helps thicken it because, you know, it's kind of liquidy filling. It doesn't really have anything in it to keep it from being watery. So that little 2 tablespoons of whole wheat pastry flour will help it get thicker. And that's probably another whiskable thing. So let's get our whisk back in here. And you could use any thickening agent. We could have used our tapioca starch, corn starch, pretty much any kind of flour that you have on hand, rice flour. But whole wheat pastry flour is a nice light flour. It's probably made from white wheat, so it doesn't give things that dark look. You know, it makes it look like you used white flour. And then we have, remember, our ground pecans and our chopped pecans. We get them in here, and we mix this up. And when I made my cookies for testing this yesterday, I put some of this on some dough and kind of crimped the edges to make it look like a tart, and I had the most delicious cookies. So just another idea for the future. And then we're gonna take this, remember our shell, get all this out of the way. We're going to just pour it in our prepared pie shell. And you can see it looks kind of thin. It doesn't look like there's much to it. But that's exactly how it's supposed to look. And it's not supposed to overlap or, you know, come up over the edges because we don't want it to drip out. This is about the right height we want it. We can kind of flatten it out a little bit. So now the last part is I'm going to create my design on the top of it. So by design, what I mean is I'm going to place some pecan halves on top of the pie in some kind of pretty circular design. So what I usually do is I start with 6 pecans in the center. And it doesn't have to be perfect. You know, like if you didn't want to mess with this, I've seen people just scatter pecans over the top. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're kind of, I don't want to use the term obsessive compulsive, but if you're kind of like that, you know, you like things to be very orderly, then, you know, you're like me and you want to go through and pick all these nice, perfectly shaped pecans and then put them all in a design. So this is going to take a minute to do. And then after I do that, we'll move on to the next step of getting it in the oven. All right, I'm down to the last few of these. Got a nice little pattern going. It does take time, but to me it's worth it. And if you really look closely at your pecans, they have kind of a top and a bottom. And the top is like a little pointy head, and the bottom is round. So I have them all facing the same way too, because if you don't, then it doesn't look as uniform. And we could even put one in the middle, but I'm not going to because I don't think that would fit very well. So now I'm going to stick this in the oven. Let's open my oven door first. And it's 30 minutes at 350. But I'm going to check it at 25 because I think my last one didn't need to cook quite that long. So speaking of that one, This is the one I made previously, and you can see that it is very nice. And we're going to cut it and put it on a plate, and you can see how it looks cut up. We have to make sure we cut all the way to the crust, which is always an issue when you're cutting a pie. If you don't cut it all the way through, then when you try to lift it out, it leaves the crust behind. So take your time when you're cutting your pie out. And then I got a couple of tools to use. I have a little offset spatula, and I'm going to see if it will come off the edge of my pie plate, because remember, we don't have any way to oil things, so we have to make sure we can get it off there. So I kind of pre-lifted it off to make sure it would come off, and I'm really gently messing with it, because you know the first piece is always the hardest. And then I can lift it out. Came out very nicely, and it looks pretty good. And you can look in the pie. Got that little tip that got left behind, but that's pretty small. And if you look into the pie, it looks like a regular old pie. It's got crust. It has, you know, the pecan layer. It stays together nicely, which is why we wanted to be sure and use a little bit of flour so it isn't runny. And then the true test, of course, is how does it taste? So I'm just going to take a small bit of the front. I think it's great. You know, does it taste exactly like the pecan pie that I made for my family for whatever, 50 years? Well, maybe not that long, 40 years? No, because it doesn't have eggs and butter and all that kind of stuff in it, but it tastes really good. So for my current taste buds, I like it. And I don't need to put anything on it. However, I could put something like coconut whip. You can buy frozen cocoa whip. Has a little bit of fat in it, but heck, you know, for a Christmas dinner, stick a little cocoa whip on it. If your pie looks a little dry after you've had it sit out, which mine looked a little dry after sitting out overnight, I brush the top with maple syrup. So that's why it has a nice little shine to it. So take a silicone brush and take just a thin layer of maple syrup and put it over the top, and that will make the appearance look better, because it will look a little dry. But yeah, that's it. You could also use some kind of dairy-free ice cream. You can find some ice creams that have very little fat in them, that are mostly like a iced milk, but made with non-dairy milk. So something like that would be good. But I think you'll really enjoy this recipe. I love the crust, the fact that it tastes like a real pie crust. And the pecan part is fabulous. Get the best pecans you can find. That's really important. If you go to the grocery store and buy a bag of cheap pecans that have been in there for a year, and you get them out and they're all shriveled up and they look like nothing, it's not going to taste very good. So if you can go to a store that has fresh pecans in the bulk section that you can actually see how they look, I would go there. And I hope you make this. And thank you very much for watching. Subscribe to my channel. You can also find me on Facebook, Instagram, just various social media outlets, and I hope you follow me. So thank you very much. Bye.